Color space. It's a term we all hear in the world of color grading. It's a term most of us probably have to use at some point, and it's a concept that most of us are probably a little bit fuzzy on. I know I was. So today, I want to give you a really clear, simple understanding of what a color space is and why it matters to us as colorists. So here we go. I'm going to start off by giving you the simplest possible definition that I can think of for what a color space is. All in the world a color space is an explicit characterization of the color response of either a capture device or a display device. So that would mean a camera or a display or a monitor, okay? That's all in the world of color space is a numerical characterization of the way a camera captures color or the way a display shows color. That's really all there is to it. And if we want to go a little bit more granular than that, there's really just two pieces that allow us to form a color space, or two pieces of information that we use to make that characterization that we call a color space. The first of those is what's called a tone curve. So examples of tone curves would be linear. That's the simplest tone curve. That's the way light works out in the real world. If I double the amount of light out in the real world, the amount of light is indeed doubled. That's a one-to-one relationship out in the real world. Things only get more complex when we start talking about eyes and displays and cameras, right? Those can have all kinds of different responses. Those can have a log response or a gamma response. And those are all just ways of describing the relationship between changes in intensity in the scene versus changes in recorded intensity in the camera, or changes in reproduced intensity in the case of a display. To put a simple visual on this, let's take a look here at this shot. I'm just going to bypass my color management for now, which, by the way, is the point of everything that we're talking about. Color spaces exist. Color spaces are necessary because they are the building blocks of color management. Without color spaces, we cannot have color management. That's what they're really there to facilitate, is the navigation of the journey from what the camera saw to what the display can show, so that we can pull off that magic trick of reproducing an image that looks like it did when you were standing there on the day gathering the scene in camera. But let's go back here to our demonstration of the response on the luminance side of an image. If we look right here, we can think of this as a linear response to the stimulus. And you can see that because pick a point on the x-axis here, which we're going to say represents input. Let's say we're exactly halfway. This is 50%. 0 is here, 100 is there. This is 50%. And then let's look at where that outputs me. Well, turns out that outputs me at 50%, right? And no matter what point you pick on this curve, you're going to find the same thing is true. Input equals output. That's one-to-one. That's a linear relationship. Boy, would life be simple if we got to do everything in linear spaces or in linear tone curves. It's not quite that simple in motion imaging for a variety of reasons. But for now, I just want to focus on how that variation can appear. So if we look at a really common log encoding here, this is an ARRI log C3 encoding. You can see that that linear relationship that I just characterized, not true anymore. Let's look at that same 50% mark. We're actually close to it here, aren't we? 50 in is about 50% out, but let's look at another point. Let's look at 25% in. Well, 25% on the x-axis is right around 40% on the output, right? And over here at 100% on the input, we're not even at 60 on the output, right? So that one-to-one linear relationship has changed. There's all kinds of reasons why that may need to change or why we might want that to change, but suffice it to say for now that this is one of the two things that defines a color space. What is that relationship between input intensity and output intensity? That's number one. Now, number two is related to the color side of things. So I want you to think about it this way. Our eyes have a reddest red, a greenest green, and a bluest blue that we are capable of seeing. If you put a red that is redder than your eye is capable of seeing, you won't see it at all anymore. It falls outside of the visible spectrum. And remember that red, green, and blue are just arbitrary terms for wavelengths of energy. And there are wavelengths, in fact, most wavelengths of energy that we can't see at all. So our human vision has what's called a color gamut. That's really the part of the color space that we're talking about right now. First part was a tone curve. This part is a color gamut. Our eyes have a color gamut. And just like our eyes, cameras have a color gamut. And just like cameras, displays have a color gamut. And if we are going to get a reproduction on a particular display that accurately reproduces what the camera was shown, That display, we need to translate between what the camera saw and what the display can show. We're going to do that by looking at the tonal response that we just talked about, the tone curve. And we're also going to do that by looking at, well, what does 100% red mean to this camera? Because 100% red to this camera, that's not the same color as 100% red to this display. And that's, again, part of this explicit numerical characterization that a color space is. So we can say, well, 100% red, 100% green, and 100% blue mean this to me when I'm talking about my camera. But to this display, here is what 100% red, 100% green, and 100% blue mean. That allows me to translate in between the two. Like we said, color spaces are the building blocks of color management, which is, of course, the foundation of what we do when we're color grading, which is to use good color science to transform what the camera saw into what the display can show. Those two variables, what the camera saw, what the display can show, those are characterized and we can move between them because of color spaces. So that's really all in the world of color space is a numerical characterization of the way a camera responds to a scene and of the way a display responds to a signal that we send to it. And by having color spaces and having the concept of color spaces, we can get images that look like the scene that was originally gathered. That's the magic trick of image reproduction. Now, here's the good news. You don't have to become a color scientist. You don't have to understand all of these things at a granular level. You simply need to understand in your mind that when I say color space to you, all I'm talking about is an explicit characterization of either a camera or a display. And furthermore, if I start throwing all kinds of different color spaces at you and say, oh, Rec 709 or P3 or Arri Log C3 or Arri Log C4 or Sony S Log 3, you can be empowered by remembering that these are all just shorthand. These are all just names for different characterizations of the way different devices respond to light in the real world or the way that they respond to a signal that we are sending to them. So you don't need to memorize all these color spaces. You don't need to know the math for all these color spaces. You just need to know that that's what I am describing to you when I say, for example, Canon C Log or Sony S Log 3. I'm talking about a color space which is explicitly numerically defined by its response to changes in intensity or luminance of light and by what it sees as the reddest possible red, greenest possible green, and bluest possible blue. That's all a color space is, and I really hope that empowers you to think a little bit more clearly about them and to feel more confident when you are talking about color space and when you are navigating pipeline and issues with color management and these other things that come up all the time for us when we are color grading.